to her mistress's daughter's house. The mistress's daughter, Elizabeth, is 16 and is shortly before giving birth and has a fever. And in her delirium has accused a neighbor of witchcraft. And Boos and several others spend what will be Elizabeth's last night on earth with her. And they hear, in the middle of the night, a sound like stones rolling down a hill or coming down a chimney, but it doesn't stop, and a scratching on the bedstead. And at one point, Elizabeth sort of comes out of her stupor and screams that there's a dark thing at the foot of her bed, a malevolent shape. Think about this. We have an African woman enslaved named Boos in 1657 in East Hampton that we can say something about. It's kind of remarkable. So then there's more people. Let me just point out, you can see in the very center, the big C's, that word right there is Boos. And what this is a handwritten deposition taken in the witchcraft inquest prior to her 1658 trial, prior to the accused 1658 trial. I personally find that incredibly powerful, to think that someone in East Hampton in 1657, this is March by this time, spoke to Boos, knew Boos, and wrote her name down, and there it is. And here we are in 2019 looking at it. I find that extraordinarily effective. How about the next slide? I think is the, perhaps, so this is jumping to sort of how the project began, and like a lot of these things, they kind of begin in innocence. This is the gravestone of Ned, a man who died a free man in East Hampton in 1817, and I wrote a column in the Star, sort of naively lamenting that nothing else would be known about Ned. And I was very quickly called out on that by Hugh King, whose wife Loretta O'Ryan said, no, to the contrary, Ned is all over the town records. And it turned out indeed he was. The town trustees hired Ned several years in a row to ring the church bell, then sometimes to sweep and ring the church bell. And then there was a woman named Peg who was hired to sweep and ring the church bell, often for more money than Ned. Absolutely no idea what's going on. So these same town records, I think it's fascinating. So when you know something about Ned now, you flip to page 350, and the first two reverends in East Hampton kept meticulous records of the baptisms and deaths of members of their flocks. And in those records, from those records, with an intern about 3 years ago, we pulled 320 names that we suspected were people of color, either enslaved, indentured, or free blacks. And that was our starting point. So let's jump to the next slide. So these are a clue, perhaps. These are nails from a house built in East Hampton somewhere between 1685 and about 1723. It's Isaac Miller House. Why I think these are important is that from 1704, for about 70 years, a white man named Robert Hudson and his son Samuel were the town blacksmiths. Hudson and Samuel, we know from other sources, were slave owners. And if there's anything, any of you've ever done basic blacksmithing, the first thing you do, and you slog it out, is you make nails. So it is conceivable that these nails are pulled from a house under renovation in East Hampton this year, were made by the hands of enslaved Africans. Now the key thing here for us is that we have these 320 names, and we know nothing about them. So we try to sort of learn what we can about their status to move them from a list of possibly enslaved persons into either free blacks or enslaved persons. And the records that are held locally are an extraordinary treasure trove. So perhaps there aren't physical monuments to these people who lived here, but there are astonishing pieces of paper around. In those days, there wasn't really any cash, so a very, very little coin. So business was done on a hybrid barter-like system in which my debt to you, for example, for a piece of cheese would be satisfied by labor you did for me, labor I did for you later on. So what we have is records of everyone in East Hampton town doing things as far back as the 17th century. One of the great treasure troves for us, maybe just jump to the next slide, was found in the Hedges family shoemaker's book, or books. There are many of these journals, because whether you're rich or poor, whether you can afford cheese or not, there is one thing that you probably need in East Hampton in the winter, and that's shoes. So we have a guy by the name of Cato, and we know Cato, a Cato or two from the church records, that Cato gets 43 pairs of shoes over a 6-year period. But what's fascinating about Cato is that Cato is described as Colonel Mulford, '(S) Cato. So then we have a bit of a clue to Cato's status. And then we can begin to look at other records. There's wills and probate records, there's bills of sale, and we can begin to get a picture for each of these now 252 people that we can name, from Boos in 1657 to Tamer, who in, I have to make sure I get this year right because it's astonishing, 1829, she was sold for $25. And this is essentially after emancipation in New York State, mind you, that she was going to remain enslaved until age 18 in 1833 or 34. So let's pop to the next slide. So of the physical monuments, this is really one of the few that was sort of ever known, and this was again back to the starting point with Nick. This is Peggy, who had been a servant and enslaved in those days when you were talking about African people were essentially synonymous. She died in 1778. She was 22, and she's buried and has a headstone in the South End burial ground in East Hampton. And at the very top there, you can see the Gardner, cross of the Gardner windmill. The Gardners and the Huntings and so on are up the hill. So one of the things that we learned by going all through these records is the ubiquity of slave ownership in the colonial period. And it is essentially any person of means in East Hampton had enslaved persons in their house. The Reverend Nathaniel Hunting, from whom I am descended, I think he would be my 8-time removed great-grandfather, himself described his Negro girl Gree dying in about 1720. He kept detailed household records, and on one page of the records, he describes the bedding inventory. And he has Jimmy and Betty's room, and it has an old bed, a bolster, 3 pillows, and 3 old blankets. And below that is the room of 2 other people who appear to be enslaved, not family members. And they have a handmade bed, 2 pillows, no bolster, and 2 old blankets. And you flip to the page of his daughter, and of course she's got a handmade black and white percale, lovely, 500 count Egyptian cotton sheets. So there begins to be amazing detail in local records, and I'm not just in East Hampton. And through this, we can begin to be able to say something about every single enslaved African, free person of color in East Hampton during that period. For example, 1676 in the town records, John appears. John is a free black man, and the town fathers notice he's building a house in Ye Street, and they give him leave to continue doing so. However, and they give him a little piece of land for a garden or a yard. They say, this is fine, John, but you cannot sell this piece of land. You cannot leave it to heirs, and if you remove from this place, it shall revert to the way it was before. What was a free black man? Who was he? 1676 in East Hampton. There's a lot of questions. But just by asking the question, we change our reality. And that, what I think is the strength of what we call the Plain Sight Project, is that by asking who was here and what did they do, we succeed in putting them back in the narrative absent anything else. And why I think this is important and potentially transformative is that our shared myth of the American origin really remains the Pilgrims. So, you know, kids are taught in school to this day, around Thanksgiving, they build the little paper hats, and that's where America came from. But of course, we know that that's not true, but that is still what children will say if you ask them, where did America come from? But the truth is that if the European colonists built the towns that became the United States, the 13 colonies eventually became the United States, that's a sort of collective myth we've bought into. But if enslaved and free African people worked side by side with the European colonists, didn't they too build America? So Boos and Japhet and Increase, with whom she shared a house in 1657, we know about them in 1665, they're mentioned in a will, a draft of a will. They helped build America. And so we think by pointing out that East Hampton, for one, was built to no small measure by these people's hands. We believe Long Island, New England, and hence America is built that way. And the Plainsight Project essentially looks to quantify the contribution and presence of enslaved Africans, and we hope to export it to other communities. Already we have a group in Southold that has begun to express some interest in trying to do that in their community. And I believe we've already changed East Hampton, and I actually think we can change America.